Welcome to Critical History. My name is Tristan. Today we're going to look at codenames and cryptonyms. If you're a fan of modern history, you may have read of an operation or project name and wondered, why'd they choose that name? Well, sometimes there's a story behind a name, and today we'll look at some of the most interesting names and their stories. You probably already know some famous military operations or project names: Barbarossa, Manhattan Project, MK Ultra, Overlord, Desert Storm, and Paperclip. Some of these codenames are obvious. Desert Storm was an aerial campaign against Iraq. It clearly gives us an image of a war in the Middle East. The Manhattan Project was named because it started in Manhattan. But some names tell a story. Names like Unthinkable, Brother Sam, Mincemeat, Stargate, Midnight Climax, Artichoke, and Big Buzz. Did you know that the US Secret Service provides codenames for individuals? Which president do you think was codenamed Rawhide? Or Renegade? Or Mogul? There's a famous figure codenamed Kitty Hawk as well. In today's video, I'm going to tell you about what famous leaders thought of codenames and two stories of codenames and their unintended consequences. Finally, we're going to look at strange and funnier project codenames and why they got that name. So World War II was really the war we saw cryptography and cryptanalysis become an important field of intelligence. And no, not that crypto you're thinking of. Cryptography is the study of code breaking, which is decrypting and encrypting messages. You start to see code names for operations play an important role in both morale and intelligence. Many leaders understood this. Best probably to explain the importance of code names was Churchill. In 1943, he spoke to his chief of staff about operations names, and the quote's full of Churchill-era language. He said, "Operations in which large numbers of men may lose their lives ought not to be described by code words which imply a boastful and overconfident sentiment such as triumphant, or conversely, which are calculated to invest the plan with an air of despondency such as woe-betide, massacre, jumble, trouble, fidget, flimsy, pathetic, and jaundice. They ought not to be names of frivolous characters such as bunnyhug, Billingsgate, aperitif, and ballyhoo. After all, the world is wide, and intelligent thought will readily supply an unlimited number of well-sounding names which do not suggest the character of the operation or disparage it in any way, and do not enable some widow or mother to say that her son was killed in an operation called Bunnyhug or Ballyhoo." And so we can see that military operation names were important not only for morale. But despite this, in 1944 I did manage to find a British Air Force operation named Chattanooga Choo Choo, so I'm not sure if the British Air Marshal got the message to not name operations things like Ballyhoo. Churchill was right to be concerned about not giving away too many details, and we'll find out later in the video why. At times the Allies did give codenames that were allusions that a keen codebreaker could have gleaned information from. For example, there was the Alsos mission, which was part of the Manhattan Project. General Leslie Groves, who was responsible for both programs, almost changed the name of the Alsos mission because he was informed that in Greek it also translated to Groves. Ultimately, he didn't change it because he realized that this may draw more attention, so the name was kept. Later in the century, agencies and military branches applied what we call naming conventions. Richard Helms, the CIA chief in the late 60s and early 70s, recalled in his memoir, "Codenames for most agency operations are picked up in a sequence from a sterile list, with care not taken not to use any word that might give clue to the activity it covers." This doesn't seem consistent across fields. In 1977, you had the Stargate project, in which the US military investigated using psychic and paranormal phenomena for intelligence. They did never open up a portal to the Upside Down, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The first story about codenames involves two interconnected events during World War II. These events all happened during the backdrop of the Blitz, which is around 1940 and 1941, the early stages of the war, when the German Luftwaffe, in no better terms, bombed the absolute shit out of Britain. While the British underwent this relentless air campaign, Polish and British intelligence worked behind the scenes to get ahead of German operations. In Britain, Bletchley Park was the centre of the British code-breaking, where the renowned Alan Turing, who basically invented modern computers, managed to break the German Enigma cipher. Now, if you don't know much about the Enigma cipher, use the Enigma machine, which produced an encrypted message. It's much like a modern typewriter, and when you typed on it, it gave you these letters to produce your message. Now, unlike previous codes, the same key never produced the same letter. Decoding this involved way more maths than I can understand, but Numberphile, they've done a fantastic video explaining the mathematics of the Enigma cipher and how hard it would be to decode this message without a computer. They also did make another video that explains how they managed to break this Enigma cipher, so please check them out if you're interested. Once they did break the Enigma cipher, they found plenty of strange terms and codes in the Nazi messages. The Nazis, we could say, had a flair for the dramatic. This carried over into military terms. For example, the invasion of the Soviet Union was named Barbarossa, actually after a famous 12th century German emperor. Barbarossa took part in the Third Crusade. If you look at it, what I'm trying to say is they weren't exactly so subtle. Alongside this cryptanalysis work, you had a technological race called the Battle of the Beams. Beams here refer to radar, which had just been invented. Also, a side note, if you've heard that carrots give you a night vision, this is actually a myth created around that time by the British as propaganda to hide the fact that they had developed radar. Soon the Germans were using radar technology to detect bombers, and there was a race to develop countermeasures to jam these systems. One of the first systems the Nazis used was codenamed Knickerbein, and it was revealed later to be a two-beam system that triangulated locations. Knickerbein, also translated literally to crooked leg, was the name of a mythical raven that could see hundreds of kilometres into the distance. Due to their love of mythical illusions, Reginald Jones, a scientist at Bletchley Park, began to suspect that German codenames could be interpreted to find hidden technical information. So when an Enigma message was decoded and referenced a Wotan system for radar targeting, he realised that there could be something more to the name. He called his colleague, who loved mythology, and quote, replied, "Yes, he was head of the German gods. Wait a moment, it had only one eye," and then shouting triumphantly into the telephone, "One eye, one beam. Can you think of a system that could use only one beam?" They were to use this fact and develop countermeasures to jam this radar. The success continued. Another system was named Freya, and since she was a companion, or what we might say, girlfriend to Odin, they supposed these systems might work together. And later, when Allied forces captured these systems, it was discovered that Freya had helped Wotan for targeting. Jones does recount that this did not always consistently work, writing, "One cryptographer, learning that the Germans had in hand an operation called Freischutz, spent a whole night reading the score of Der Freischutz in hope of finding a clue." This example does show you that codenames can impart meaningful information. This brings us to Operation Unthinkable, which was a war plan developed by the British in 1945. What do you reckon it entailed? I'll tell you later in the video. The second story I'd like to tell you about codenames also takes place during World War II, but a little later in the war in early 1944. This was as British and US generals were preparing for the invasion of northern France in what would become the D-Day invasion. Plans and details were top secret, and the British took great care in creating disinformation to hide their true plans. This had already been completed successfully in 1943 during the invasion of Italy. This is one interesting disinformation operation, initially called Trojan Horse. Again, something that slightly uncovers what the plan actually entailed. This would be changed to Operation Mincemeat, which according to the wiki source I found, was chosen off a given list. Mincemeat's a bit of a coincidental and gruesome name for what actually the plan involved. It's concocted by Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. And by the way, he also happened to work for the Ulsos team that I mentioned earlier in the video. The deception was simple. Naval intelligence created fake invasion plans and top secret dispatches that showed that the Allies would invade Italy through the Balkans, rather than Sicily, where they actually were going to invade. They would then plant these on a corpse, dressed as a naval officer, and leave this where the Germans would be able to recover the body. The Spanish coastline was decided to be the best location for this. The body was of Glinda Michael, a homeless man who died eating rat poison. He was given a new name of William Martin, complete with pictures of a fake girlfriend, ticket stubs to a London show, keys and change. Surprisingly, the plan worked, and the Germans reinforced the Balkans rather than the south of Italy. Ian Fleming had actually gotten the idea from a spy book he had read. an example of art imitating life. I got a little sidetracked here. Mincemeat is an excellent example of deception and the misinformation and disinformation the Allies used during the war. In early 1944, as D-Day loomed, security officials began to be alarmed by the answers of crossword puzzles in the Daily Telegraph. And that's the British Daily Telegraph, not the Australian rag that we know of today. First there appeared Utah, which was no cause for alarm because it's a common US state, then Omaha a few weeks later, then Overlord, Mulberry, and Neptune. Overlord was the code name for D-Day, and the rest of these words were different names for landing sites and vehicles. The security risk was so large that MI5 arrested Leonard Dorr, the man responsible for writing the crosswords at the Daily Telegraph. They interrogated him for several hours, but came to the conclusion that it was a massive coincidence. This was the accepted story for years afterwards. But only in the 1980s did Ronald French come forward and explain the real story. Leonard Dorr was a school headmaster, and to create his clues he would actually ask older students to provide words. The school they attended to had been evacuated to the countryside of Surrey, close to a military base and where US forces operated. Ronald French was a student at the time. Ronald French says he heard the code names used by the military and provided them to his headmaster, maybe not knowing exactly what they meant. The Germans never did discover these code names in the Daily Telegraph, but if they did, it could have spelled disaster for the D-Day invasion. And so that adage, loose lips sink ships, really rings true. After the war, codenames seem to have become a bit more laxer and descriptive. One codename that was extremely top secret at the time was Operation Paperclip. Essentially, when the war ended, the US and USSR competed to acquire German scientists that they could use in producing weapons and technology in the kind of growing Cold War. Many of these German scientists should have been tried at Nuremberg for war crimes, but instead they were provided with visas. If you've not heard about this, I suggest reading Annie Jacobson's book, Operation Paperclip, which goes into great detail about it, and it's a fascinating read. Paperclip actually has many real-world implications. The US may have not won the space race without scientists like Wernher von Braun, who came from Operation Paperclip. Paperclip was initially called Overcast because the camp which housed the German scientists was in Bavaria, and I guess Bavaria is always overcast. If you're from Bavaria also, please write in the comments if this is true. Paperclip got its name from officers processing the documents. They would add a paperclip to the files of those they wanted employed. Steve Kinzer in his book claims a different story. He says that clerks began using paperclips to mark the files of prisoners whose backgrounds presented the most troublesome cases. During the Cold War, the US Biological Weapons Department gave some of the most descriptive names. There was Operation Sea Spray, and that was a biological weapons test which involved spraying San Francisco Bay with a supposedly harmless bacteria. There was Operation Big Buzz and Big Itch, which were biological weapons tests, again in Florida, using mosquitoes on civilians. These names were maybe a little bit too on the nose, and later operations were named things like Dropkick, Top Hat, and Mayday. The CIA also had some strange operation names. There was Operation Bluebird, which was to find a truth serum, and because they wanted prisoners to sing like a bird. This operation would later morph into a program called MK Naomi and MK Ultra. The letters MK were designators, and it actually meant it originated from the Technical Services Staff, the wing of the CIA which provides gadgetry for operations. The reason it was called MK Naomi was apparently because it was named after a secretary of this office. And what gal wouldn't love to have her name used for a secret biological weapon experiment? MK Ultra, probably the most famous codename used, or at least I know it from the Muse album, was named because the CIA chief Alan Dulles, because according to Kinzer, Dulles could not resist giving this new project a name that reflected what he called its ultra-sensitive nature. I'll leave this video with the last few funny stories I've heard about Codenames. Probably the funniest story I've heard was the original name for the invasion of Iraq, Operation Iraqi Liberation. It was changed because presumably someone in the Bush administration realized that the acronym spelt oil. It's changed to Operation Iraqi Freedom. Earlier in this video, I asked you which president was rawhide, renegade, and mogul. So the Secret Service apparently gives certain letters to the president, and their family choose words based on the list of those letters. Reagan was rawhide. I think he played a cowboy in one of his films. Obama was renegade, and his wife Michelle was Renaissance. Their daughters were Rosebud and Radiance. Who do you think chose mogul? Yes, you guessed it, it was Trump. Melania was given the codename Muse. Researching this, I found a funny anecdote. The daughter of Al Gore, Karana Gore, in 1993 was asked to choose her own name, and she writes, "Ever since 4 years ago, when I was put on the spot and told 2 syllables, and it had to start with an S, I've been cringing in the back seat when identified as Smurfette." A more recent example is during the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the current Russian-Ukrainian war. You might have seen military vehicles such as helicopters or tanks adorned with the letters Z and V. Those symbols have become so prolific that they're even used as pro-war symbols, and some countries have banned them. Some people refer it as the swastika. Lots of people have tried to interpret the meaning of these 2 letters. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed on Instagram that it was an abbreviation for the phrase "za pobyedu," which means in Russian for victory. Another suggestion, also by a Russian source, was that it was "Zamir," which means for peace. Other people have suggested that it stands for "Zapad," which means west in Russian, and V stands for Vostok, which is east. The best theory I've heard is that it's the initials of Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. And if we think back to names like Operation Overlord, that personal nature and personal attack seems relevant when we talk about operation names. So I've covered some of the code names and stories about them that I think are funny and interesting, but I realise there are thousands out there. If you know of a code name or operation name, it might not even be a military name, maybe like a business name or a plan you think is funny, you can put it in the comments. Also in this video I realised I went rather quickly over details of some operations. For example, Mincemeat actually has like an hour-long documentary about it. If you are interested in these different operations, maybe you've not heard of them before, I do plan on making more videos explaining them in greater detail, and I'm going to make a series. This is my first YouTube video. Really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. I'll also put in my description my link to my website and the book sources I took for my information from. This has been your host Tristan at Critical History. Thanks for watching.